Smoke the color of dried blood rolled across the ridge, and every barn for 3 miles was already gone. But on one small claim in the Wyoming grass, the flames stopped dead at a strange brown circle scorched bare to the dirt. 41 goats stood inside that ring, chewing calmly, while neighbors who had laughed all summer watched their own roofs collapse. Back in late April, before any of it, Adelaide Ferris stood at the gate while her husband Whit counted coins twice. "Folks judge a thing by how it looks," she said, "but worth is what it does when the trouble comes." Whit only grunted, eyes on the thin animals milling in the seller's pen. He wanted cattle, sleek and respectable. What they could afford was 41 bony goats nobody wanted. Adelaide squeezed his hand. "Let them prove themselves before we believe the laughing." The Ferris claim sat in a shallow draw east of Lodgepole Creek, 160 acres of bunchgrass, sage, and stubborn rock that Whit had filed on 3 years prior. The cabin was small but sound, chinked tight against the winter wind, with a single window facing the morning. Behind it stood a barn Whit had raised mostly alone, and beside the barn rose their one real treasure, a haystack built tall through a summer of aching labor, enough fodder to carry stock through the cruelest months. They had come west with a wagon, a plow, and a tin box of savings that grew lighter each season. Whit was broad through the shoulders and quiet by nature, a man who measured twice and spoke once. Adelaide had grown up on a hardscrabble farm in Missouri and knew the worth of a patient hand. They wanted, more than anything, to make the place pay, to stand at season's end with something to show besides calluses. Cattle were the dream. Everyone in the county measured a man by his herd, and the cattlemen rode tall and easy past smaller folk. But a yearling steer cost more than the Pharisees could spare, and a proper herd was beyond all reckoning. By April, their tin box held barely enough for a dozen head, and a dozen head was no herd at all. Their nearest neighbor, Pruitt Vance, ran 400 cattle and a mercantile besides, and held paper on half the small claims in the draw. He was a smiling man whose smile never reached his eyes, and he had offered more than once to buy the Ferris claim before it broke them. Whit had declined each time with the same flat courtesy. The land itself worried Adelaide more than Vance did. 3 dry winters had left the prairie thin and brittle. The creek ran low. The sage crowded close around the buildings, and the cheatgrass grew thick and pale between the clumps, curing to tinder by midsummer. She did not yet have words for the danger. She only felt it, the way a body feels weather coming in the joints. When word came that a homesteader 12 miles south was quitting the country and selling his goats cheap, 41 of them scrawny and unloved, Whit rode out mostly to look. Adelaide went along because she could not bear to wait at home. Neither of them guessed that the worthless animals in that seller's pen would one day stand between them and ruin. The seller was a gaunt man eager to be gone before another winter. "Take the lot," he said, waving at the goats with something like contempt. 41 head. "They'll eat anything, climb anything, and they won't fatten worth a dime. I'm asking near nothing." Whit walked the pen slowly. The goats were indeed a sorry sight, ribs showing, coats rough, horns crooked, eyes yellow and insolent. They watched him with no fear at all. One nibbled his sleeve. Another stood atop the water trough as if it owned the place. "Cattle would be the sensible buy," Whit murmured. "Can't afford cattle," Adelaide said softly. "We can afford these." He looked at her a long moment. The price was less than a single good steer. 41 living animals against a dozen. Something practical in him stirred awake. He turned to the seller, drew out the tin box, and said, "We'll take them all." The trouble started before they reached home. Goats, it turned out, did not drive like cattle. They scattered, doubled back, climbed the wagon wheels, and bawled in a chorus that carried across the open country. It took Whit and Adelaide the better part of a day to herd the 41 12 miles north, and by the time the cabin came into view, both were footsore and second-guessing every coin they had spent. "Maybe," Whit said that night, rubbing his neck at the table, "I've made us a laughingstock." He was not wrong about the laughing. Within a week, the whole draw knew the Favrises had spent their savings on a flock of bony goats, and the news traveled with the speed that only foolishness can manage. Riders slowed at the gate to gawk. At the mercantile, men grew suddenly busy with their hat brims to keep from grinning. Pruitt Vance made a point of riding by. He sat his fine horse and surveyed the goats with open amusement. 41 of them, he said, counting with mock care. I'd heard, but I had to see it. Ferris, a man buys cattle to build something. Goats are what a man buys when he's giving up and don't know it yet. He tipped his hat to Adelaide with exaggerated courtesy. When you're ready to sell the claim, you know where I am. I'll even take the goats off your hands for soup. Witt's jaw tightened, but he said nothing until Vance had ridden off. He's not wrong that they look like nothing, Witt admitted. Looks again, Adelaide said. We keep coming back to looks. Yet even she had doubts in the small hours. The goats ate constantly and fattened not at all. They could not be milked for much, could not be sold for beef, could not be driven anywhere without a battle of wills. They climbed onto the woodpile, onto the wagon, once onto the very roof of the chicken coop, where one stood silhouetted against the sunset like a creature with no respect for sense. Adelaide laughed at that, to spite herself, and the laughing eased something. She began to watch them more closely. She noticed what they ate. Not the good grass a cow would want, but the rough stuff, the sage, the thistle, the dry, brittle cheatgrass that crowded the buildings, the brush nobody else would touch. They stripped a patch of thorny scrub bare in an afternoon and seemed pleased with themselves. They eat things nothing else will, she said to Witt, watching a doe demolish a tangle of dead brush by the barn. The useless things, the dangerous things. Witt only nodded, not yet seeing it. But the seed was planted now, waiting on the season to make it grow. By the middle of June, the change came hard and fast. The wind shifted to the dry southwest and did not let up. The creek shrank to a trickle. The cheatgrass cured from pale green to the color of old straw, and it stood thick as fur against the cabin, the barn, the precious haystack. One afternoon, Whit walked the perimeter of his buildings and felt the danger for the first time the way Adelaide had felt it for weeks, a tightness, a wrongness in the brittle hush. He crouched, snapped a stem of cheatgrass, and watched it crumble to dust in his fingers. Then he looked over at the goats, methodically demolishing a stand of brush, and something in his face changed entirely. "Addie," he called, "come look at this." That evening, an old herder named Cyrus Bell stopped at the gate, drawn by talk of the goats. He had spent 40 years tending flocks in dry country from Texas to the high plains, and he looked at the Ferris animals with a respect no one else had shown them. "Folks here don't know goats," he said, accepting a cup of coffee on the step. "Back where I come from, we used them to clear the brush from around a place before the dry season turned mean. A goat'll eat a fire's dinner before the fire ever gets to sit down. You've got yourself a tool, son. Not a joke." Witt and Adelaide sat up late that night with Cyrus Bell, and by the time the old herder rode off into the dark, they had the bones of a plan. The idea was simple to say and hard to do. Use the goats to eat away every scrap of brush and dry grass in a wide band around the buildings, so that if fire ever came racing across the prairie, it would reach their place and find nothing left to burn. "A ring," Witt said, drawing it in the dirt with a stick by lamplight, all the way around the cabin, the barn, and the stack, wide as we can make it. "How wide?" Adelaide asked. "Cyrus says the wider the better. 30 feet won't stop a grass fire driven by this wind. He says go for 100, more if we can. 100 feet of brittle prairie, stripped to bare dirt, all the way around 3 buildings. By hand, it would have taken a month of scything and grubbing and burning was the one thing no sane person did in a season this dry. But 41 hungry goats, moved a little each day, could do the eating for them. The trick would be making the goats eat where they were wanted, and nowhere else. They started the next morning. The goats, left to themselves, would wander to the sweetest grass and ignore the rough brush that mattered most. So, Witt and Adelaide had to think like the animals and outwit them. The first tool was rope. Whit ran long picket lines between iron stakes, and to these he clipped shorter tethers so that the goats could be strung out in a working row along the line they wanted cleared. It took half a morning just to learn the knots that would hold against a goat's determined tugging and still come loose when a person wanted them to. The animals protested at first, then settled to eating with the single-minded greed that was their one great virtue. The second tool was the thorn fence. From the very brush the goats cleared, Whit built low barriers of cut scrub, woven and piled, to block the directions he did not want the flock to drift. A goat would climb most things, but a thick tangle of thorn bush was more trouble than it was worth, and they learned to turn aside from it. Adelaide gathered the cuttings as the goats worked, and Whit wove them into the growing fence so that the cleared land itself became the wall that shaped the next day's work. The third tool, and the cleverest, was salt. Adelaide discovered it almost by accident. She had set out a lump of salt for the goats one hot afternoon, and the whole flock had drifted toward it, abandoning the easy grass to crowd around the precious mineral. She watched them, and an idea took hold. If she placed the salt at the far edge of a patch of brush, the goats would eat their way across the whole patch to reach it, clearing everything in between. "They'll work for salt," she told Whit, delighted. "We just put it where we want them to end up, and they eat a path to get there." It became a daily rhythm. At dawn, Whit moved the picket lines a few yards out, expanding the ring. Adelaide set the salt at the day's far boundary and refilled the water trough, for thirsty goats would not eat. Through the long hot hours, the flock chewed and stripped and trampled, turning a band of standing tinder into bare brown earth. In the evening, Whit hauled the lines in, built up another length of thorn fence, and the two of them stood back to see how far the cleared ground had grown. It grew slowly at first, then faster as they learned the animals' ways. The goats, it turned out, were perfectly suited to the work. They ate what cattle would not touch: the sage, the rabbit brush, the thistle, the dense dry cheatgrass packed close to the buildings where a scythe could barely swing. They stood on their hind legs to reach high brush and stripped it to bare stems. They nosed into rocky pockets a plow could never reach. The very stubbornness that made them poor cattle made them tireless eaters of the worthless and the dangerous. The neighbors, of course, found the whole business hilarious. Word spread that the Ferrises had now taken to walking their goats on ropes, like a string of fine dogs, moving them about the yard with lumps of salt, and building fences out of thornbush. Riders detoured to watch. One man laughed so hard he had to dismount. Pruitt Vance rode by twice that week, and shook his head with the pleasure of a man whose low opinion has been confirmed. Whit's ears burned, but he kept moving the lines. What the laughing neighbors could not see, because they would not stop laughing long enough to look, was that the ring was working. Day by day, the band of bare earth widened around the Ferris buildings, a clean brown moat in a sea of cured yellow grass. Where the goats had passed, nothing remained that a fire could feed on. No brush, no cheatgrass, no dead sage, only trampled dirt and the bitten-down stubble of plants too low to carry a flame. Adelaide kept a careful eye on the work and began to refine it. She noticed that the goats left untouched a few stubborn plants they disliked, and that some of these were the very ones that burned hottest, the resinous sage especially. So she took to grubbing those out by hand in the goats' wake, finishing what the animals started. She also learned to read the flock. A contented goat ate steadily, an anxious one wandered. By keeping water close and salt placed just so, she kept all 41 calm and chewing. Whit, for his part, grew obsessed with the width and the gaps. A firebreak was only as strong as its weakest point, Cyrus had warned him, and a single uncleared strip could carry flame straight across. So Whit walked the ring each evening hunting for thin spots. A clump of brush the goats had skirted, a draw where the grass grew thicker, a place where the wind might funnel embers across. Wherever he found a weakness, he moved the goats there the next day, salting the far side to draw them through. The hardest stretch was the high brush along the western edge, where the land rose toward the open prairie. The wind came from there, and Cyrus had said plainly that the west side mattered most. If fire came, it would come on that wind. The brush grew thickest there, tall and woody, and even the goats balked at some of it. So Wit cut the worst of it down with an axe, dragging the cut limbs clear, and let the goats clean up the rest. He widened the ring to nearly 150 feet on the western side, twice what he managed elsewhere, until the cabin sat behind a broad brown apron of stripped ground. It was brutal work, and it never seemed to end. The goats had to be moved, watered, salted, and counted twice a day, for a goat that wandered off into the brush could undo a week's caution by getting itself lost or hurt. The thorn fences had to be mended where the animals breached them. The picket lines tangled and had to be sorted. Both Wit and Adelaide fell into bed each night, too tired to talk, their hands cracked and their backs aching. But there was a strange satisfaction in it, too. Adelaide found she had grown fond of the goats, of their insolence and their cleverness and their refusal to be anything but exactly themselves. There was the lead doe she'd named Juno, who always found the salt first and led the others to it. There was the little black wether who climbed everything and surveyed the world from the woodpile like a sentry. There was the way the whole flock would lift their heads at once when she came out at dawn, expecting their water, expecting the day's work. They were not respectable animals. They would never make anyone rich. But they were earning their keep in a way no cow ever could, and she had stopped being ashamed of them. One evening near the end of July, Wit walked the completed ring from end to end while the sun went down red behind the western brush. All the way around the cabin, the barn, and the towering haystack ran the band of cleared earth, wide and unbroken, swept nearly clean of anything that would burn. Inside the ring, the buildings stood on their island of safety. Outside it, the prairie rolled away in every direction, gold and brittle and waiting. He came back to the cabin step where Adelaide sat, watching the goats settle for the night. "It's done," he said, "all the way round. I can't find a gap in it. You think it'll hold, if it ever comes to that?" Wit looked out at the dry country, at the wind bending the far grass, at the haze that had hung in the sky for weeks. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I hope we never find out. But I'll tell you this. I've stopped feeling like a fool." Adelaide reached over and took his rope-burned hand in hers. Out in the dusk, the goats lay down one by one inside the ring they had eaten, 41 bony animals that the whole county had laughed at, resting now on the bare, safe ground they had made. Neither Wit nor Adelaide knew how soon the testing would come. But the work was finished, and it was good, and for the first time in weeks they slept easy. The county fair fell on the first Saturday of August, and the Farises went, as everyone did. It should have been an ordinary day, but midway through the afternoon, talk turned, as it always did, to the strange business of the goat ring, and Pruitt Vance held court by the livestock pens, entertaining a crowd at the Farises' expense. "Walks them on ropes," Vance was saying, "feeds them salt like sugar to a child, builds little hedges of thornbush. I tell you, the man has lost his reason." The crowd laughed. Wit stood at the edge of it, face hot, and for a moment the old shame nearly swallowed him. Then Adelaide took his arm. "Let them laugh," she said quietly. "The grass is drier than I've ever seen it." The first week of August turned the country to powder. The wind blew hot and unrelenting from the southwest, and the sky took on a brassy haze that never quite cleared. The creeks stopped running altogether, leaving only stagnant pools. The grass that had been gold turned gray and snapped underfoot. Old-timers said they had not seen the prairie so primed to burn in 20 years, and they said it in low voices, as if naming the danger might call it down. The laughing did not stop, but it changed in flavor. Now it had an edge to it, the meanness that comes when prosperous folk grow uneasy and need someone to look down on. Pruitt Vance led the way. He had grown genuinely irritated by the Farises, Adelaide thought. Not because they amused him any longer, but because their quiet persistence shamed something in him. Twice more he rode by with his offer to buy the claim, and each time his smile had less warmth in it. "You can't eat goats, Ferris," he said on the second visit. "You can't sell them. Winter's coming, and that stack of yours won't feed 41 head, and your milk cow both. You're going to come crawling to me by Christmas, and when you do, the price I offer won't be near as friendly as today's." He gestured at the wide ring of bare earth. "And what in heaven's name is all this scraped dirt? You've made your place look like a buzzard's roost. No grass, no garden, just dust and goats. It's impsmifn to the whole draw." Wit met his eyes. "It's a firebreak." Vance laughed out loud. "A firebreak. Listen to yourself. There hasn't been a real fire through here in years." "There hasn't been a dry like this in years either," Wit said. Vance only shook his head and rode off, and his laughter trailed back on the hot wind. But the doubts came creeping in again, as doubts do, and they were sharper now for having a grain of truth in them. Vance was right about the winter. The cleared ring had cost them weeks of labor they might have spent cutting more hay, and now the stack looked smaller than it should against the months ahead. The goats ate constantly and gave little back. The garden Adelaide had meant to plant had gone in late and small because every hour had gone to the ring instead. If no fire came, they would have stripped their own land bare and beggared themselves for nothing. And the whole county would laugh them clear out of the draw. "What if Cyrus was wrong?" Wit said one night, staring at the lamp. "What if all we've done is starve ourselves to make a bald patch in the prairie?" Adelaide had no certain answer. She believed in the work. She had felt the danger in her bones for 2 months now, but belief was not knowledge, and the winter ahead was real and near. She lay awake doing sums in her head. The hay, the goats, the silk cow, the dwindling tin box. The numbers did not come out kind. Then came the worst blow. Cyrus Bell, the one man in the county who understood what they were doing, who had given them the plan and the confidence to follow it, rode by to say goodbye. A son in Colorado had sent for him, and at his age he could not refuse. He sat his horse at the gate and looked over the finished ring with quiet approval. "You did it right," he told them. "Wide on the west, clean all the way round. If it comes, that ring'll do its work." He paused. "But mind, a ring only stops what crawls along the ground. Fire, this dry, can throw sparks ahead of itself on a wind like this. Embers. They'll land inside your bare ground and look for something to catch. So you keep that roof wet if it ever comes, and you keep anything that'll burn pulled back from the buildings. The ring buys you the chance. You've still got to fight." Then he tipped his hat and was gone, and the Ferrises were alone with their bare dirt, their bony goats, and a county full of people waiting to be proven right. The fire came on the 11th of August, in the hottest hour of the hottest afternoon of that terrible summer. No one ever knew for certain how it started. Some said a passing wagon's brake threw a spark. Some blamed a careless pipe. Some said it was only the dry lightning that had been flickering along the western horizon for days. It hardly mattered. What mattered was that out on the open prairie to the southwest, where the wind was born, a thin line of flame stood up in the gray grass and began to run. It ran fast. Driven by that hot, unbroken wind, fed by grass cured to pure tinder, the fire crossed the open country faster than a horse could gallop. A wall of orange, perhaps 10 feet high, throwing up a churning column of smoke that could be seen for 30 miles. The smoke went up brown and then black, and across the whole draw, people came out of their houses and looked west and felt their stomachs drop. Adelaide saw it first. She was carrying water to the goats when she caught the smell, that sharp, sweet, terrible smell of burning grass, and looked up to see the smoke boiling into the brassy sky. For one frozen moment, she simply stared. Then she ran. "Wit! Wit, it's come! Fire from the west!" He was already moving by the time she reached the cabin, having seen it from the barn. There was no time for fear, only for the things Cyrus had told them. They moved with the speed of people who had imagined this hour for 2 months and knew exactly what to do. The goats first. If the flock panicked and scattered through a gap in the thorn fence, they would run straight into the fire. Whit and Adelaide drove all 41 into the small corral hard against the cabin's east wall, inside the very center of the ring, on bare-swept ground, and lashed the gate. The animals milled and bawled, smelling the smoke, but they were penned and safe. Then the roof. Cyrus had said, "Keep it wet." The creek was nearly dry, but the trough and the rain barrel held water, and the well held more. Whit climbed to the cabin roof while Adelaide hauled bucket after bucket, her arms screaming, and he soaked the shakes until they ran dark and dripping. Then the barn, then the precious haystack. They could not wet the whole stack, but they wet the windward face of it and pulled back the loose hay around its base so that no trailing wisp could carry flame to it. All the while the fire grew. It filled the western sky now, a roaring wall, and the sound of it reached them. A deep, hungry, freight train rush that no one who has heard it ever forgets. The light went strange and orange. Ash began to fall like dirty snow. The heat arrived before the flames, a pressing oven breath that dried the sweat on their faces. And then the embers came, just as Cyrus had warned. The wind flung burning fragments ahead of the main fire, and they rained down across the Ferris claim, landing in the bare-swept ring, where they sputtered and died on the bitten dirt, finding nothing to catch. But some landed closer. One caught in a tuft of grass the goats had missed near the barn, and Adelaide was on it in an instant, beating it out with a wet sack. Another smoldered on the cabin roof and hissed dead in the soaked shakes. They ran from spark to spark like that. Two small figures against the vast advancing fire, putting out each ember as it fell. Across the draw, others were not so ready. The Pharisees could see, even through the smoke, that the fire had reached the first of the neighboring places. There was a glow, a fresh tower of smoke. That meant a barn had caught. Then another. The flames that found those farms found brush grown right to the door sills, dry grass standing thick against the walls, and they took everything. Barns, sheds, fences, haystacks, roaring through in minutes. The wall of fire bore down on the Ferris claim. Whit dropped from the roof, took Adelaide's hand, and the two of them stood at the cabin's east wall with their goats and their wet sack sets, and watched the flames come to test the ring they had eaten into the prairie. The fire reached the western edge of the cleared ground and seemed for one heart-stopping moment to leap. A great gust drove the flames forward, and a sheet of fire bent low across the bare dirt, reaching, and a long tongue of it found a strip of grass near the barn's western corner that the goats had only half cleared, a thin spot Whit had meant to widen and never had. The grass caught. Flame ran along it straight toward the barn wall, and Adelaide screamed his name. For an instant it seemed the whole work had failed, that one missed strip would carry the fire across the ring and into everything they had, just as it had carried into every other farm in the draw, and all their labor would burn with the rest. But Whit was already there. He hit the burning strip with his wet sack and his boots and his whole desperate body, beating, smothering, dragging dirt over it with his bare hands. Adelaide flung the last of the trough water across the grass. The flame guttered, fought, and, because there was so little to feed it, because the goats had eaten away all but that one thin ribbon, it died. The barn wall scorched black but did not catch. The fire, reaching the end of that lonely strip, found bare dirt on every side and nothing more to take, and then it was past. The main wall of flame, racing along the ground, struck the wide western edge of the cleared rings and simply stopped. There was nothing to burn. The fire reached the bare earth the goats had made and died there along its whole length, sputtering out in the swept dirt, splitting and flowing around the island of safety to either side, and racing on east across the open prairie beyond. It left the ring untouched. It left the cabin, the barn, the haystack, and the corral full of bawling goats standing whole inside the circle of bitten ground. Whit sat down hard in the dirt, his hands blistered, his face black with soot, and for a moment he could not speak. Adelaide knelt beside him. All around them the prairie burned and the air roared, but inside the ring it was only smoke and heat, and the two of them, alive, with everything they owned intact. "It held," she whispered. "Addie, it held." The fire burned itself out against the river to the east by nightfall, and the wind died with the sun. When morning came, the Ferrises walked out of their ring into a changed and blackened world. The prairie was a sea of char in every direction, smoking and gray. But their cabin stood, their barn stood, their haystack stood, its windward face singed, but its heart untouched, and their 41 goats, released from the corral, walked out onto the bare-swept ground and began, with perfect insolence, to nose about for something to eat. Whit looked at the standing buildings, and then at the goats, and he began to laugh. The draw had not been so fortunate. As the smoke cleared over the following days, the full reckoning came in, carried farm to farm by stunned and soot-stained riders. The fire had run nearly 6 miles before the river stopped it, and in that running it had taken a terrible toll. 4 barns gone, countless miles of fence reduced to lines of ash. Haystacks that represented whole summers of labor burned to nothing in minutes. Sheds, corrals, a smokehouse, a granary, all gone. By some mercy, no person and few animals had been lost, for the fire had come in daylight, and folk had run their stock ahead of it. But the winter feed of half the draw had burned, and with it the prosperity of a dozen families. Pruitt Vance had been hit hardest of all. The fire had swept through the heart of his holdings. His big hay barn, the pride of the county, was a heap of smoking timbers. His winter hay was ash. The grass his 400 cattle depended on was burned to the roots across thousands of acres, and with no feed and no hope of grass before the snows, he faced selling off the herd that had made him the great man of the draw, selling at a loss, into a market suddenly flooded with every other burned-out rancher's cattle. The Ferris claim stood like a green and brown island in all that blackness, untouched, and word of it spread even faster than word of the goats had spread in the spring. People who had laughed all summer rode out to see it with their own eyes. They stood at the edge of the cleared ring, where the char of the burned prairie stopped in a clean line against the bare, swept earth, and they looked at the standing cabin, and the standing barn, and the standing haystack, and they did not laugh anymore. "It stopped right here," one neighbor said, towing the line where black met brown. "Came all that way and just stopped, on account of the goats." The goats themselves, sublimely unconcerned with their new fame, went on being goats. They climbed the woodpile, they escaped the corral. Juno the lead doe got onto the cabin roof somehow and had to be coaxed down with salt. They were exactly as bony and insolent and disreputable as they had ever been, and now the whole county looked at them with something close to awe. What happened next was the part Adelaide would remember longest, and it began with a wagon at the gate. It was the Hadley family, whose place lay 2 miles east and whose barn and hay had both burned. Mrs. Hadley sat the wagon seat with 3 children and a careful pride. "We've no feed left," she said plainly, "and I'll not beg, but folks are saying you understand this brush clearing business, and we've still got our house and our stock and a long winter coming. I've come to ask how it's done." Adelaide and Whit looked at each other, and here was the moment Adelaide understood, where a person's true measure was taken, not in the having, but in the giving. "I'll do better than tell you," Whit said. "I'll bring the goats." He did too. Over the next weeks, while the autumn rains brought the first green haze of recovery to the burned ground, Whit and Adelaide drove their 41 goats from farm to farm across the draw. At each place they showed the families how to string the picket lines, how to weave the thorn fences, how to lead the flock with lumps of salt, how to read the wind and find the thin spots, and clear the dangerous brush back wide from the buildings. The goats ate their way around barn after barn, house after house, leaving each one ringed in safe bare ground against the dry seasons still to come. The Ferrises asked nothing for it but feed for the goats while they worked, and goodwill which they received in abundance. They could not undo the winter that was coming, but they could help their neighbors meet it, and they did. When the Hadleys came up short on hay, Whit and Adelaide, who've had so little themselves, sent over a wagon load from their singed but standing stack. And when the word got round of that, other families who had been spared shared what they had. And the draw drew together through the hard months in a way it never had in the easy ones. As for Pruitt Vance, the great man came to the Ferris gate himself before the first snow. He did not smile this time. He sat his horse stiffly and looked at the ring of cleared ground and at the goats, and at last at Whit. "I came to say I was wrong," he said, and the words seemed to cost him dearly. "I laughed, the whole county laughed, and I led the laughing, and you saved your place while I lost half of mine." He paused. "I've cattle to sell and no feed to carry them, and I'm not the man I was a month ago. I came to ask, if you'd be willing, whether you'd bring those goats to my place. To clear it, before next summer, I'll pay a fair price, and I'll not say another word against you as long as I live." Whit looked at him a long moment. He could have gloated. The whole draw would have understood it if he had. But Adelaide watched her husband's face and saw him choose the larger thing. "We'll bring the goats," Whit said. "No charge between neighbors. And Vance," he held out his hand, "if you're selling cattle cheap into a bad market, we've got bare ground here and money saved we didn't spend on a herd in the spring. Maybe we can talk. Maybe we both come out of this winter better than we went in." Vance stared at the offered hand. Then he took it, and something in his hard face eased, and for the first time since the Ferrises had known him, his smile reached all the way to his eyes. That winter the Ferrises bought 40 head of good cattle from Pruitt Vance at a price that was fair to them both, and ran them on the recovering grass come spring. They kept the goats, of course. A person did not part with animals that had saved everything. And they never again let the brush grow close around their buildings, nor laughed at a thing merely because it looked like nothing much. A year later, on a green morning in early summer, Adelaide stood at the same gate where she had once watched her husband count coins twice over a pen of bony goats. Now the draw spread out before her in recovered grass, dotted with the rebuilt barns of neighbors who nodded to her on the road. Inside the wide ring of cleared ground, kept bare and safe each season now by the same insolent flock, stood her cabin, her barn, her cattle, and her growing prosperity. The goats grazed the brush along the ring's edge, doing their quiet work. Juno climbed atop the woodpile and surveyed her kingdom. Whit came to stand beside his wife, and together they looked out over the land that the laughed-at goats had saved. "Worth," Adelaide said softly, "is what a thing does.